Thank you. Welcome back to the second session. This session is about how North Korea is likely to use their nuclear capability or weapons if they have. So it is related, is follow-up question what Minister Yu says in the opening remarks. Actually, I'm Vice President of Asan. My name is Chang. So I joined Asan about 3 months ago. Before that, I was in IFANS. So I'm very pleased to be here with you and also this panel. So we have 4 speakers here today. The first speaker is Bob Manning. He is at the Atlantic Council, and he's very well-known strategist as a thinker in the United States. So he was actually he served as a senior strategist for the National Counterproliferation Center from 2010 to 2012. So he has various posts assumed in previous years. And the second speaker is Dr. Park Chang-kwon. He was former Navy captain. Now he's a senior research fellow at KIDA, Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, where I used to work from 92 to 98, and 2002 to 2005. So, and then he will be followed by Professor Su Hao. He is professor at China Foreign Affairs University. So he's also in Department of Diplomacy and Chinese Foreign Affairs, in Department of Diplomacy. And the last speaker is Mr. Sugio Takahashi, the senior fellow at National Institute for Defense Studies. Because I'm expecting very heated debate in this session. So in this session, we will discuss how North Korea is likely to use, as I said before, is likely to use their weapons, in what way, under what condition, and how we are going to respond or deter the North Korea from using the nuclear weapons. So there could be is kinds of imaginative work instead of there is no concrete way to assess the North Korea's strategy, or nuclear strategy at this point of time. It's all kinds of hunches there. So, but I assume you have read maybe that Sugio, when he was here about a week ago, he mentioned the existential deterrence of North Korea. So I wonder what actually that means and what kinds of implications it has the other countries. Of course, the United States and South Korea now they are talking about extended deterrence. The EDPC was established and still working, Extended Deterrence Policy Committee. So in that framework, South Korea and the United States are working harder to come up with more reliable deterrent measures. So I wonder whether Dr. Park Chang-kwon can make some comments on that, maybe as far as he can. I hope we can share the information. And also, I'm sure that China has also its own understanding of North Korean way of thinking. Maybe Professor Su Hao is in a position to say something about this, what North Korea is thinking, and also what would be the Chinese response on that. So without further, I'd like to invite Mr. Bob Manning.
Thank you. I want to thank the Asan Institute for inviting me here. What I want to do is talk a little first broadly about the challenges and complexities of extended deterrence in the 21st century, and then focus, and the 2 components, deterrence and assurance, and then focus in on the Korean specifics. During the Cold War, deterrence was nasty but simpler. We had a balance of terror that evolved after a period where we had a kind of predictable, more transparent, managed competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We don't have anything that simple or clear today. And I think the concept, the challenges of deterrence have assumed a kind of a new importance. I think the Asan Institute poll earlier this year made that very clear in terms of Korean public opinion after North Korea's 3rd nuclear test. It's become a very important issue, not just in Korea, but also in Japan, where the U.S. also has extended deterrence commitments. So, and I think, let me talk for a minute about the kind of nuclear environment, because although the U.S. and Russia have moved to reduce the amount of nuclear arsenals they have and may go further. All the other nuclear players are going in the other direction: China, India, Pakistan, and as well as North Korea. And I think this poses new challenges and new threats. But there's also some new opportunities and possibilities for strengthening deterrence. And then I think and behind me a chart where I exhibited my limited PowerPoint skills, trying to create a kind of visual imagery of what constitutes deterrence. In the emerging security environment, we just heard a lot of discussion about North Korean missile and nuclear capabilities. And you have to remember, they've been going at this for almost 40 years. They're quite serious about it, and I hope some of our panelists were correct in assessing the limitations of their skills in that regard. But in this environment, I think we have to understand that today, deterrence is not just nuclear. It involves a whole range of new factors and three components: military, non-military, and the military, nuclear, military, conventional. And I think all those pieces of the puzzle have to be in place because at the end of the day, the credibility of extended deterrence is in the eye of the beholder, both the deterred and the assured. And in this, I think we also have to look at increasingly capable Chinese nuclear posture that has developed increasingly sophisticated second strike capability, and the possibility and other technologies that could constrain U.S. maritime access to East Asia. And of course, the U.S. conventional presence is an important component of deterrence. So. And one issue, again, is there's a tension between the Obama administration's declared goal of moving to zero eventually and our extended deterrence commitments. I think the Nuclear Posture Review in 2010 tried to kind of square that circle. But the nuclear universe that I've just described, I think, is going exactly in the opposite direction of zero. And I think in my mind, I think we have to rethink the notion that less is better or safer, which I think would be news to the administration, but nonetheless, I think it's true. So, when you look at particularly Pakistan, which is on a breakneck course developing not just quantities of weapons, but dangerous new battlefield nuclear weapons that raise a lot of questions about doctrine and control. And I think in what some have called the second nuclear era, the biggest challenge is no longer the threat of nuclear holocaust amongst the superpowers, but nuclear security, where you have more and more players with more and more fissile material. And that's something I think the Obama administration has been put a focus on, to its credit. In fact, the last summit was held here in Seoul not too long ago. And let me just look a little bit about North Korea. I think what we've heard is a tremendous uncertainty about what they've got and what they can use. Most estimates seem to be in the 4 to 10 weapon range. I think the troubling element is their enriched uranium, which we have less ability to track, and which could give them the ability to create a much larger arsenal. And also, of course, starting Yongbyon again, that gives them enough plutonium for about a bomb and a half a year, if that keeps going. So that's something we have to look at. The architecture of deterrence in Korean Peninsula, I think, requires not only factoring in changes in this threat environment I've discussed, but determining how the non-nuclear components of deterrence are best utilized and integrated into the structure and content of deterrence. So let me talk for a minute about some of the non-military tools. In regard to North Korea, I think sanctions, even if they may be less effective in terms of their ability to generate enriched uranium, are an important element in, they're what we have is, to the extent we have them, teeth in making a clear statement that the world will not accept a nuclear Korea, and that it will not accept North Korea acting in a normal universe of nations to the degree that they are moving in that direction. I think that's an important part of declaratory policy, which, and of course another important part has to be made very, and I think we've done this on numerous presidential statements, to minimize the prospects for miscalculation by Pyongyang. It has been made very clear to them that if they launch a missile or start a conflict, that's the end of North Korea, and we will see the reunification of Korea under Republic of Korean auspices. And I think they understand that, and to that extent, I think deterrence has worked. One of the it's the gray areas, I think, that cause a lot of questions. When you have things below that threshold, because deterrence tends to work at the existential level. If you think back during the Cold War, deterrence worked in the sense that the Soviet Union didn't invade Western Europe, but it didn't stop them from doing things in Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And I don't know if this is a fair analogy, but when you look at some of the lower gray areas or below the threshold, things going on in the region, whether it's the East China Sea or the South China Sea, these are often held up by our friends as a test of deterrence. I'm not sure how fair that is as a test of deterrence, but again, it's all about perceptions at the end of the day. I think that the one overlooked element is the economic dimension. I think the Korean-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, the TPP Accord, and hopefully in the near future, U.S. energy exports to our friends in Korea and Japan and elsewhere are an important part of demonstrating that the U.S. has woven itself into the fabric of the Pacific economy, and it underscores our stake in the success of the region. And I think that's important in terms of perceptions of the U.S. as a Pacific power that do matter. But the foundation, of course, of the Center of Deterrence remains the U.S. nuclear umbrella and the combined U.S. ROC conventional force capabilities. We don't know whether North Korea has, we just heard in the previous panel, miniaturized a warhead or have a missile that if they have, that they can reliably deliver it on. But as I say, I think deterrence works. I think one question going forward as they try to develop the Musadon, which is about a 3,500-kilometer missile, and then the KN-08, a mobile ICBM, which there's some distance from operationalizing, but nonetheless, some people think that's a game changer in the sense that it gives them a survivable second strike that could attack anywhere in the continental United States. And so that it may raise the question of at least the perception of decoupling. I don't think that that's true. I think deterrence, the one reliable thing I think we've learned about North Korea over the years is that they're not suicidal. They may be reckless, but they're not suicidal. Last thing I want to talk about was just raise since 2010, we've institutionalized the Extended Deterrence Policy Committee between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea. And I think this is important because it increases transparency, it allows more cooperative planning, and has put us on a course. And then these other complexities gives us a forum for dealing with the other complexities, which is missile defenses, and then the role of cyber and space. Now, in cyber, declaratory policy may be important in the sense of making it very clear that any cyber attack that, no one's ever died in a cyber attack. We have to keep that in mind, because we hear a lot about cyber. But if a cyber attack that goes after U.S. infrastructure or kills anybody, it should be made very clear that the U.S. will reserve the right to a kinetic response. I think that kind of declaratory policy could be an important strengthening element of deterrence. And the one particularly complicating thing in terms of Korea is on missile defense as we develop more capable missile defense architecture, because it's one thing to build an architecture that deals with what we assess as a North Korean threat, but the problem here also, it gets conflated with China, and China's very worried about missile defense architectures that might put at risk their strategic deterrent. And the problem, there's a bigger problem here in that we have no framework for strategic stability with China. We have a pretty lousy relationship with Russia, but we do have a certain framework for stability, predictability, and transparency. For the last 10 years or so, we've been trying to get a dialogue with China at the official level started, and they've resisted all efforts to do that. And I think their argument, of course, I think we're the asymmetries between the modest Chinese force and the U.S. force are so great that we're a long ways from the possibility of arms control. But I think the Chinese have this culture of secrecy, and they see transparency as a weapon of the strong against the weak. But as we move forward with missile defense capabilities, if we don't have a sense of predictability about what the Chinese force is, we don't know where to draw the line. So I think that their culture of secrecy is beginning to work against their own interests. And it'd be helpful if both the ROK and the U.S. Interlocutors with the Chinese continue to make that kind of argument, because I'm not sure they've thought that through. And then finally, looking ahead over the next decade, I mean, we have the 2015 OPCON term, or I'll let Mr. Park talk a little bit about that. But that raises, again, I would like to see that as an opportunity to better integrate U.S. and ROK combined forces, particularly in areas like missile defense architecture. And finally, and I'll close on this, the importance of trilateral cooperation between the U.S., ROK, and Japan, particularly on things like integrating our cyber response capabilities and our missile defense architectures. I think we have a troubled Japan-ROK relationship that's put limits on that, and I think the imperative of strengthening those elements of deterrence ought to be very seriously considered in both Tokyo and Seoul as they plot the future of their relationship. And I'll close there.
Thank you. Really enjoyed, actually, you widened our scope to include non-military deterrent measures. I think that's very, very important one. And also, secondly, as you mentioned about the missile defense, that is one of the more controversial issues in Korea right now. And also, third is like whether it is possible to or desirable to have a trilateral cooperation between Korea, Japan, and the United States on this dimension. I'm sure that we can hear my Korean colleague and also the Chinese colleague on those, as well as the Japanese colleague on those. So I'd like to invite Dr. Park Chang-won for his presentation.
As we discussed the last session, most experts assess that North Korea possesses a sufficient amount of nuclear materials to make a number of many nuclear weapons. Also, Institute for Science and International Security, located in the United States, assessed that on the warhead neutralization capabilities, it said that North Korea has the capability to mount a plutonium-based nuclear warhead on the Nodong missile, but still lack of ability to put a warhead on ICBM. Also, North Korea revised constitution in 2012 mentioned that it is now a nuclear state. Also, North Korea made it clear that it will strengthen nuclear weapon power in quality and quantity, and will possess and exploit nuclear weapons until the world is denuclearized. So we cannot be optimistic about the denuclearization of North Korea. So nuclear deterrence system is so important on the Korean Peninsula. Currently, the United States and South Korea closely cooperate to build a nuclear deterrence system. The United States clearly and repeatedly reassured the extended nuclear deterrence commitment to South Korea. At the 2010 SCM, Security Consultative meeting between the US and South Korea, South Korea and the US agreed to hold extended deterrence policy committee, already mentioned by Dr. Choi. After 2011, since 2011, we have held EDPC regularly. So had a lot of talk on the threat of North Korean nuclear threat, how to deter North Korean threat. At the 2012 SCM, the allies agreed to develop a tailored deterrence strategy against North Korea nuclear threat until 2013, this year. So I think that the two ministers between the US and South Korea are going to sign the TDS, tailored deterrence system, at the SCM early next month. South Korea actually wants to develop a deterrence strategy to counter three types of North Korean nuclear aggression: nuclear threat in peacetime and in local conflicts, actual military movement for imminent nuclear attack, also the actual use of nuclear weapons. The tailored deterrence strategy we are discussing now may well reflect these South Korean concerns, I think. South Korea also make great effort to construct a kill chain and missile defense system for enhancing its own deterrence capabilities. If there are clear signs of imminent North Korean nuclear attack, kill chain provides capability to destroy and neutralize North Korean nuclear missiles and related equipments for self-defense before the enemy actually carries out nuclear attack. Considering the South Korea's geostrategic characteristics and massive destructive power of nuclear weapons, South Korea cannot accommodate the first strike of North Korean surprise nuclear attack. Even one nuclear weapon strike can cause catastrophic damages on South Korea. Last year, actually, revision of missile guideline between the US and South greatly extend South Korea the range of ballistic missiles. So South Korea now can develop and acquire more ballistic missiles covering the whole area of North Korea, but it will take time to build that kind of capability, I think. On missile defense system, South Korea decided to build terminal-based missile defense systems. Even though kill chain and the missile defense system can help dissuade North Korean behavior, considering the characteristics of nuclear weapons, North Korea may not fear South Korea's new conventional capabilities. Therefore, South Korea should rely on US extended deterrence assurance for its security. The allies of the US and between the US and South Korea need to make continuing efforts to develop and strengthen a tailored deterrence system. I think South Korea and the US currently established the basic principles or guidelines for implementing the tailored deterrence system. Nevertheless, there are many things we have to strengthen for building credible nuclear deterrence mechanism. South Korea has a lack of knowledge and experience on nuclear strategy and nuclear crisis management. There will be many questions, challenges for South Korean decision makers to implement tailored deterrence measures. In addition, there are many issues the allies need to discuss, such as how to share responsibilities, how to improve intelligence sharing, how to implement a tailored deterrence system in a crisis. Also, we have to strengthen the credibility of US extended deterrence by maintaining a solid combined defense system. Combined defense system between the US and South Korea is a basic foundation, actually, for keeping the credibility of US security commitment to South Korea. Examples in the past crisis indicate that North Korea usually retreats in a crisis when the US clearly demonstrates its will and capability to support South Korea. I think as North Korea gets more confidence on its nuclear capabilities, it is more willing to use its nuclear capabilities against South Korea, especially as the conventional military balance between the South and the North is tilted toward the South. North Korea may have more temptation to use nuclear weapons in a conflict with the South. We can think of various scenarios on North Korea nuclear provocation. North Korea may attempt to divert internal crisis or instability by creating nuclear crisis with South Korea. Though North can use its nuclear capability in contingency situations, local conflicts, and all-out war, especially considering North Korea's inferiority of conventional forces compared to those of the US and South Korea. Nuclear forces provide a good instrument for North Korea to constrain South Korea, demonstrate its military superiority, and impose its will upon South Korea. The goal of South Korea and the US nuclear strategy is to make North Korea give up nuclear provocations. But North Korea well knows that South Korea and the US cannot carry out serious military retaliation unless all-out war is not occurred. This strategic restriction induced the North uses nuclear capabilities more actively in peacetime and in a crisis. In fact, it is very difficult to dissuade peacetime North Korean nuclear threats. Political and economic sanctions rather than military means would be more effective to influence North Korean behavior in peacetime, I think. Because all the countries oppose North Korean nuclear program, it is relatively easy to get international support against the nuclear provocation. But there are four major issues I think we need to consider for the successful deterrence of North Korean nuclear provocation. The first is to strengthen crisis management system and nuclear consultation mechanism between the two allies. The effectiveness of all the nuclear strategy relies on how well decision makers manage a nuclear crisis. As we know in the example of the past nuclear crisis, if nuclear crisis occurs, there will be considerable confusion on the assessments of adversaries' objectives, capabilities, response. It is not easy to make a decision with limited intelligence in a crisis, which may determine the destiny of the country. In the dynamics of a conflict, we should be very cautious of taking blind escalation, even though we have to firmly respond to North Korean provocation. We have a well-organized cooperation system to counter North Korean conventional threats. However, it is not certain that the current existing system can properly work for the nuclear crisis. I think that the US and South Korea need to develop a nuclear crisis management system in detail. The second issue we need to consider is on how to dissuade North Korean threat of nuclear use in a local conflict. Defense Minister of South Korea already declared that it will take active deterrence strategy if the North makes local military provocations like Yeonpyeong Island shelling. The active deterrence strategy implies that South Korean military will respond to North Korean attack by striking not only the origins of military attack, but also its direct support and command facilities. Also, the US and South Korea agreed that they will counter together to North Korean local provocation. These combined defense measures in a local conflict can effectively prevent North Korea's miscalculation to take escalation strategy in this local conflict, I think. In a local with North Korean nuclear threat, I think South Korea and the US need to adopt nuclear dominance rather than nuclear matching strategies. Nuclear dominance is to maintain and demonstrate superior military capabilities in every stage of escalation, and thus prevent North Korea's intention to utilize the escalation dynamics of a nuclear threat. The third strategic issue is on how to make North Korea give up the use of nuclear weapons in all-out war. North Korea can use nuclear forces in various stages of war. Maybe there are different opinions on the when and how the North Korea will use nuclear weapons. I think we should consider that North Korea may use nuclear weapons in every stage of the war. In the early stage of war, the North can use nuclear weapons for acquiring its military advantages and to compensate for its inferior conventional forces. In the middle of the war, I think it may try to prevent combined forces from moving to the north or to maintain its de facto military advantages. As a last resort, it can impose truce for its regime survival. In order to prevent the use of nuclear weapons on the peninsula, South Korea and the U.S. need to devise military options to properly counter these North Korean nuclear threats. Basically, South Korea may take two types of nuclear strategy. The first one is a proactive deterrence strategy that South Korean Ministry of National Defense already committed. The proactive deterrence strategy to destroy and neutralize the North Korean nuclear weapons by kill chain before North Korea launches its nuclear attack against South Korea, if there is a clear sign of imminent nuclear attack. The other one is, I think, our retaliation strategy against North Korea's nuclear attack. This is a very core concept for nuclear deterrence. Deterrence mechanism operates when North Korea realizes that its nuclear use will cause unacceptable costs quite larger than its political gains. In order to achieve this objective, our retaliation needs to be directed to North Korea's first security priority. It means that our retaliation strategy is to focus on the elimination of North Korean leadership as well as nuclear forces. North Korea values regime survival as its first security priority, so we need to commit to a strategy that the combined forces will undertake decapitation strategy as quickly as possible if North Korea tries to use nuclear weapons. This strategy will impose North Korean leaders to rethink its nuclear strategy. A final issue is to effectively exploit non-nuclear strategic forces in combination with nuclear forces. Nuclear forces are very difficult to be actually used in conflicts. Conventional forces provide military advantages for carrying out flexible response against North Korean provocation. Even though conventional forces have a fundamental limitation to counter nuclear threats, their destructive power and precision have been greatly enhanced, which is sufficient to threaten the adversary in North Korea. Especially, we can effectively exploit the massive conventional strike capabilities of the United States, which can create fear in the mind of North Korean leaders. Because decision makers can have many more options with superior conventional forces in a crisis, it can also raise nuclear threshold. For this purpose, we need to develop a close cooperative mechanism for the effective use of non-nuclear weapons. In conclusion, I think the nuclear deterrence is a relatively new concept to South Korea. So we should carefully check all the needed elements for the establishment of effective nuclear deterrence system and develop it more solidly. We do not have to be optimistic of North Koreans' intentions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Park. Actually, you illustrated North Korea, possible North Korea way of using nuclear weapons in peacetime conflict and limited conflict, as well as the all-out war. I think those are very important issues we have to discuss. Actually, you mentioned the nuclear component as well as non-nuclear components. So that leads us to the question of whether the United States is willing to reintroduce tactical nuclear weapons or not. That is one of the issues actually. On June 19th, actually, June 9th, President Obama further declared that actually he's going to further reduce strategic nuclear weapons as well as a withdrawal of the tactical nuclear weapons from Europe. That has some implication for South Korea. So I think that's, I'd like to ask a question about whether what is the thinking, your thinking on this, the tactical nuclear weapons and also how we are going to respond on that. Actually, you mentioned the tailored nuclear deterrence. What's the difference between tailored deterrence versus proactive deterrence? So, South Korean government first initially used proactive deterrence, and there were some questions about that. Then nowadays they are using the tailored deterrence. What that actually means, I actually proposed that word initially the tail editor is much fuller. And that also, you mentioned the full spectrum dominance of US and ROK forces. But I'd like to ask a question about what about the missile defense, and also one of the issue Bob raised about the trilateral cooperation between Korea, US, and Japan on this issue. Because we are linked, if you are thinking about all our, we are linked through the United Nations command. Because let me stop there. I'd like to invite Professor Hao for Chinese perspective on this issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chang. And I'd like to extend my thanks to the Asan Institute to invite me to be here for this wonderful event on this very important topic of the North Korean issues. I would say that at the moment, this is real time for us to discuss this kind of the issues related with the North Korea. Compared with Mr. Park, he seems a bit pessimistic, and with the approaches of countermeasure against the North Korea's, especially its nuclear ability building. But myself, personally, I am a little bit optimistic to try to find a way to manage the dilemmas of the nuclear, issues over the Korean Peninsula and also the Northeast Asia. So I would like to make the points on myself with the topic, like this: denuclearization, nuclearization, and denuclearization. Double games of national security and international security over Korean Peninsula. I would argue that regarding the North Korean nuclear issues, there's the double games on the one hand of the North Korea and the others in the international community with the double games. So I'd like to make the 3 points to elaborate my arguments. First of all, I would like to try to make my personal observation of the North Korea nuclear strategy. I could bet that nobody here in this room can access the real nuclear strategy of North Korea, but we just try to, to guess or to analyze the logic of North Korea's nuclear strategy. I would say that because previous sessions of this conference already discussing about the ability buildings of North Korea regarding their process of nuclearization. But I would argue that what kind of the definition for us to seize the North Korea? I would say that North Korea at the moment is not a real nuclear power with their nuclear weaponization, but it's just a nuclear state with some kind of stability or capability of the nuclearization. So regarding this kind of the definition, I would say that North Korea, I could say that there's some kind of the so-called nuclear strategy to safeguard their national security and their national interest. I would say that in general, regarding the logic of nuclear strategy in theory, I would say that there are 2 functions to implement the strategic decision makings of the nuclear strategy. One is nuclear attack. Another is nuclear deterrence. I would say that in this kind of logic, we also could observe the nuclear strategy of North Korea if they had. I would say that for the North Korea, they want to use the nuclear ability or capacity to make a posture or gestures to shock and overawe its enemy, like United States or South Korea, or to frighten its opponents, like the South Korea and some other its potential competitors, or even to suppress its counterpartner, like South Korea, so that makes the North Korea have their superiority in the strategic positions against the South. And even North Korea would like to use their nuclear abilities, capacity building, to make a partnership in the games with its counterpartner in the international games. So this is their intention for the challenges of the external, from outside of the North Korea. And besides such kind of external exchange, North Korea also would like to have their nuclear capabilities to their internal challenges. I would say that North Koreans would like to have such kind of nuclear capacity buildings as a source for the survival of themselves, because North Korea, as a weak state, or even regarding their internal system, economic and political system, is not very advanced for their legitimacy. So they would like to have such kind of nuclear abilities, buildings, as a means, to support their legitimacy internally. And technically, I would say North Korea would like to have such kind of their nuclear capacity buildings for the leader of regimes of North Korea to easier to control the military sector, because this kind of regime needs such kind of the way to safeguard their own regime stability and security. And also, as their special state, we know that North Korea will have so-called strategy in the future as a so-called strong and prosperous big powers in the world. So nuclear ability would like some kind of strategic pillar, support such kind of power building. So this is some kind of logic in my understanding of North Korea's nuclear strategy. So in general, I would say North Korea would like to have such kind of nuclear choice to countermeasures their challenger from outside, externally, and also from some kind of challenges inside, domestically. So this is the logic of the strategy, in my understanding. Okay, based upon such kind of analysis, how for us to understand the reasons why North Korea would like to have such kind of nuclear capacity building. I'll put the kind of point in two levels. One is games between nations. That means games between North Korea and its opponents, United States, South Korea, and some others. Regarding such kind of games, North Korea, we know that this is the weak country regarding their comprehensive national ability building. So they haven't any other choice but have some kind of special leverage or strategic leverage to support itself to safeguard their national security or prevent any possible challenge from outside to their so-called regime change. So this is their real concern for North Korea for their so-called national survival. In this regard, it's a rational choice for North Korea to obtain such kind of nuclear capacity. And also, they would like to have such kind of nuclear abilities to strengthen itself, to make them feel confidence, not only to maintain their internal stability and development, but also facing the challenge from outside. So this also is for their regime survival, national survival and regime survival. So this is their concerns for North Korea in the games between North Korea and its opponents. So in this context, I would say that North Korea seems it's a rational choice. Because in the national security games between North Korea and South Korea and the United States, it seems that the nuclear choice was their rational act. And so they should have some kind of their nuclear strategy designed for the North Korea to safeguard their national security. So this is their national games of the national security in the international arena between North Korea and others. But in the international security background, I would say that North Korea's behavior is irrational, or it is unacceptable for the international community. On the background of the grand trends of the international relations or international community building, in a Chinese observation, we say that there's two tendencies. One is globalization, another is international integration. So in this kind of two key tendencies of the international background, I would say that international security is always the concern for all our international members. So we should need their standards or norms to safeguard our security of the international community. So in this kind of the grand framework of the international security, North Korea's behavior of nuclearization takes something's great threat to our international community. Not only damages the stone corner of NPT, which will be the pillar support the international security, but also the real harmful to the countries in Northeast Asia, including China, because North Korea's nuclear capacity building is real tangible threat, to its neighbors, including China, Russia, and some others. So I would say that regarding such kind of the international community security building, North Korea's real potential and a physical threat to us in the international community. So the reason why is all of us in the international community, especially in the countries, for the relative countries in Northeast Asia, we will try to make the joint efforts to make pressure on North Korea to force them to be on the ways of their denuclearization. Okay, so in the kind of the background of their global security, I would argue that the nuclear strategy of DPRK is meaningless for their national security and also their long-term goals of so-called their strong and prosperous big countries in the world in the future. And so for our international community, there's a question for us is that how to manage our relation with North Korea. That means how we define this country. Is it a nuclearized states or the denuclearized states? It is very obvious that this rules our task to force or to coerce North Korea to be on the ways denuclearized. But at the current situation at the moment, because North Korea already has some kind of nuclear capacity, so we should find something in between denuclearization and denuclearization to manage to keep our relation with North Korea. I would say that first of all, not only our international community, but also the North Korea would have the commitment, because they already have North Korea already has such kind of commitment to abide their international norms, like the United Nations Charter, like the NPT, or like the joint statement of September 19th in 2005. So North Korea already has a commitment for that. But unfortunately, since then, North Korea already violates their international norms. So they will try to pursue their nuclear weaponization, nuclearization. But our international community should make their great efforts to prevent in the future of their nuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. So we should try to find a way to get out of such a dilemma of the nuclearization of North Korea. And this is the one way, it's a pessimistic way. But on the Chinese side, we will try to keep our efforts to resume the secret talks. The reason why is last week, myself and some other participants here in this room attended the conference in Beijing to celebrate the 10th anniversary of September talks. And China already sent a signal to outside that we'll try to make the pressure on North Korea to go back to the table. And also North Korea's partners at that time, last week, also to send some kind of positive signal. In my understanding, they already go back to their traditional position. That means that they would like to abide their previous leaders, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il's denuclearization, and also to abide the principles of the joint statement of September 19th. So that means North Korea already sent some kind of positive signal. We should grasp such kind of chance for our international community to force North Korea go further on the ways of denuclearization. So I think that this is really our opportunity in the international community to find the way to make the resolution peacefully for the denuclearization in North Korea, and also safeguard the peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Su, for giving us your own assessment of North Korea's nuclear strategy. That's more politically oriented rather than military oriented one. So, for domestic purpose as well as external purpose. So, but also you mentioned about international coordination and cooperation in denuclearizing North Korea. But we have done enough. I don't know what we can do tomorrow, so that whether you raise that we should be more engaging North Korea. So whether we should, what kinds of things we can think of beyond just the current stage, whether the United States should engage North Korea at this point of time or South Korea. So I think this, on the other hand, we have demanded North Korea's concrete action to show us, to convince us North Korea's commitment to the denuclearization. So, but on the other hand, if I come back to your own logic, if North Korea is preoccupied with regime survival, an internal problem, I don't think North Korea will give up nuclear weapons, especially in domestic purpose, because it's about the leadership, it's about the domestic, also it's the military. If that's the case, I think quite difficult to have denuclearization realized unless regime changes. So I think that's how we can match these two things together. So that's the question I have for you. Now, last but not least, I'd like to have Sugio for the Japanese point of view. Existential deterrence.
Thank you. I have big homework from the Professor Chang-san. And at first, I want to say three things before my presentation. At first, I want to say great thanks to Asan Institute to invite me twice in this month. And both two trips gave me a very huge intellectual takeaway. So this is really thanks to that. And second, I'm working as a slight part of the Japanese government. But this I hate to say these things every time I say. But I need to say my view on this presentation is my private view, not to represent my organization. And third, I'm not a regional specialist. No Korean specialist, no China specialist, no East Asian specialist. I'm a functional specialist on nuclear deterrence. So my thinking, my view on this presentation is mainly from my thought from the nuclear deterrence theory rather than regional tailored situation, actually. And the topic of the North Korean nuclear strategy is, I think, one of the big puzzle in this region. Of course, everyone knows, there are so many big puzzles in North Korea, but this is one of that. And for example, whether they have distinct nuclear strategy separate from conventional one, or whether they have, if they have distinct nuclear strategy, what is that for? In other words, is their nuclear strategy is for deterrence or coercion or provocation or regime survival, regime legitimacy? Or we don't know anything about that. So I try to do this sort of experiment about that. And from a theoretical perspective, the nuclear deterrence theory could have three different variations. The first one is counter force. The second one is counter value or counter safety. And the third one is existential deterrence. And I'm very happy to prepare these things. At first, counter force is to set the target of your military force or your nuclear force. The target is the adversary's strategic strike capabilities, including the nuclear offensive capabilities or command and control capabilities. So this is purely military to military targeting strategy. The second variation, the counter value or counter city strategy, is literally the target is the adversary's value. That means increasing cities, that increasing economic infrastructure or social infrastructure. So you don't need, you don't need to limit your target to military facilities, but you will kill so many people. And then it includes a mutual assured destruction implication, and the minimum deterrence usually is a part of this counter value strategy. And the third one, existential deterrence, is the deterrence based on the fact you have nuclear weapon. And in this case, you don't necessarily need to have the specific target set. If you have counter force strategy or counter value strategy, your deterrence, your nuclear deterrence is based on military utility of your nuclear force. So, for example, the yield of nuclear warhead, the number of nuclear warhead, accuracy of delivery vehicle, and the invulnerability of your weapon system as a whole. So this kind of physical reality, physical military reality determine how effective your deterrent is. But in case of existential deterrence, it relies on the existence of nuclear weapon in your arsenal. And in this case, you don't necessarily rely on technical reliability, technical elements. Because if you, for example, if your adversary has nuclear weapon, you don't know how much it is reliable, but there could be only 1% or 0.1% of use of the nuclear force against us. Then our decision making could be influenced. Their nuclear shadow need to be considered in our decision making process. So they influence us, they have strong restraining effect for our decision making. So in this context, the technical reliability doesn't necessarily matter. So in that sense, so I say some of the answer, so if North Korea has nuclear distinct strategy, and if North Korea has nuclear deterrence strategy, then their nuclear strategy will rely on this existential deterrence. As we discussed in the session 1, there are so many questions about the technical reliability. But as a possibility of the existence of nuclear deterrence, actually we experienced this several years as a potential of the existence of the nuclear strategy will or could have some effect on our decision making. So this is the effect of existential deterrence, and because this effect comes from the fact or our perception of the existence of nuclear weapons. So neutralization of this effect is very difficult, especially considering uncertainty of North Korean leadership. Comes from several. We don't have any trouble to pick up the example of the uncertainties of the leadership, and so just the existence or just our perception of the existence will have very big implication on our decision making. So this is very, I think, a big challenge for us. And again, there is no immediate countermeasures against this effect comes from the existential deterrence, especially with the North Korean very uncertain or unexpectable leadership. So the next question is, how do we build our deterrence strategy? And or in other words, can we be free from their nuclear shadow or not? Or how can we free from? Or how can we reduce their nuclear implication, the influence of the nuclear deterrence? So I want to switch this answer to can we continue to rely on U.S. extended deterrence in this context? And as Dr. Manning briefed before, now U.S. extended deterrence has many components, but I want to focus on the nuclear component of extended deterrence. And this question actually has two subsets of questions. The first question is whether U.S. will fulfill its deterrence commitment for alliance. The second question is whether North Korea deterred by U.S. commitment of the deterrence. So this is similar but different question. My answer to the first question is short. Yes, we can rely. First, U.S. continuously repeatedly say their declaratory commitment to alliances, U.S. Japan, U.S. ROK alliance, and both two alliances are very important for U.S. Asia strategy or Asian region security. So in that context, I think their verbal commitment to, American verbal commitment to the alliance is reliable. And second, not just that, not just our, subjective perspective. U.S. has other allies in other parts of the world. And, for example, the NATO, especially new members of the NATO, closely look at how much U.S. is reliable, how much U.S. extended deterrent commitment is reliable, credible. And, if U.S. does not fulfill the deterrence commitment to two important alliances, so NATO, especially NATO newcomers, will have big fear about that. This is big deficit for U.S. foreign policy. And the third, not just as allies, potential proliferators closely look at what U.S. is doing. And if U.S. does not fulfill, again, the deterrence commitment for two important allies, just by handful of North Korean technical dubious nuclear force, that will be the perfect recipe to proliferate, to facilitate the proliferation for other parts of the region. So again, this is not affordable for the United States. So for many reasons, I don't think we should have some doubt or some questions about the credibility about U.S. commitment and about the possibility that U.S. fulfill its deterrence commitment in case North Korea attacks us. But the second question, whether North Korea is deterred by the U.S. commitment, U.S. deterrence commitment, is different question. It is totally relies on North Korea, or in other words, Kim Jong-un's perception, subjective perception. And if they deploy, succeed in deploy nuclear-tipped ICBM, even though this is technically not necessarily reliable, but there could be 1% of the possibility to reach the United States. Then there's a possibility that North Korea overestimate the deterrent capability, deterrent effect against the United States, which comes from the existential deterrence. So this is, our perception cannot change their perception. So this is very, very difficult question to be dealt with. So to counter or to develop deterrence structure, deterrence regional architecture against this kind of North Korean overestimation of their overconfidence of their nuclear deterrence is a very difficult question. And how to tame this overconfidence is a big challenge for our side. To do that, my answer is very similar to Professor Park, and that we need more visible operational form of deterrence. So I think the full spectrum dominance is one of the option, and the missile defense cooperation will be one of the option, and as the repeated exercise to demonstrate our readiness to deal with security crisis is of course important things. Or the strengthening the U.S.-Japan or U.S.-ROK alliance is the most important. The other important things. Or I hope to develop U.S.-ROK-Japan trilateral cooperation is of course one of that. And this kind of very visible operational way to strengthening the deterrence is indispensable to tame the North Korean overconfidence, which may come from their potential nuclear-tipped ICBM or nuclear-tipped MRBM or RBM. And some of the other countries looks this kind of visible operational form of deterrence as too visible or too aggressive. But unfortunately, this is a reality of the region. With the North Korean uncertain and unexpected regional leadership and their uncertain potential nuclear force and unclear and transparent nuclear strategy, then this kind of response cannot be avoided. I think this is a reality. Thank you. I stop here.
Thank you, Takahashi. Actually, your points on existential deterrence quite interesting. It's almost like what Professor Su mentioned about North Korea's perception of the possession of nuclear weapons is more politically oriented, but actually having nuclear weapons has a great advantage of North Korea enjoys nowadays in dealing with other countries. Now about this other measure you mentioned, the missile defense system, cooperation with ROK, US, Japan, and others. So since we have about 20 minutes, I'd like to open the floor and collect more questions and ask the speakers to respond to those questions. I think the audience is stunned by the North Korean threat. Okay, please, Professor Jebin. There's a mic.
Alexander Zhebin from Russia Institute of Far Eastern Studies. My question goes to Dr. Manning. He said that for United States it's difficult to draw a line in development of missile defense because of lack of transparency on the part of China. At the previous session, we listened to two presentations by Dr. Pollack and Dr. Shilin, which actually almost persuaded me that North Korean missile threat for United States at the moment and in the next 5 years almost non-existent. Considering that, your pronouncement about the United States difficulties to draw line implies that the United States actually building missile defense against China and maybe Russia too from the beginning, because North Korean threat at the moment doesn't exist for United States. And I don't think that United States are spending billions of dollars to fight windmills, but spending them on some rational choice. And the rational choice is to nullify deterrence means of China and Russia. Will you respond?
Okay. Any other question? Yes, please.
Living from Carnegie Endowment and Tsinghua University. My question also goes to Dr. Manning. You said that the missile defense changed the game of transparency and secrecy. I do not understand why that is the case. For example, the effectiveness of missile defense depends on whether or not that system can tell a target is a real target or is a decoy. I do not believe that the United States would explain how its missile defense would tell a target is a real target or a decoy. It would hide that part. Right? That is still secrecy. That will still, important part of such kind of game. So I'd like to know how or why a missile defense changed the game of transparency.
Okay, Malcolm.
Thanks, Malcolm Cook from the Lowy Institute in Australia. I have a question that's probably most targeted towards Dr. Park or Dr. Takahashi, and it goes back to how do we reduce the nuclear shadow of the existential deterrence. I'm wondering if Japan and South Korea were to make transparent and public moves towards creating their own nuclear shadows on North Korea, whether that would be a new and interesting dimension to what we're talking about today. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other question? Who? Oh, yes, please. Ambassador Kim.
Jebom Kim, Korean American Association. My question is directed to all the four panelists, basically. Maybe it's a kind of extension from the question raised in the previous session that is there any way to prevent North Korean nuclear and missile provocations? Maybe it's too early to draw an analogy of Russian role in the Syrian problem recently, but maybe we can get some clue from the Russian intervention into that area that somehow we can harness the Russian influence because we are worn out of Chinese and US pressure, sanction versus provocations. So maybe you can give an insight to this kind of imaginary solution to the North Korean problem of missiles and nuclear threat if we can harness President Putin's political caliber to this issue. Thank you.
But there should be someone who can say we are going to invade otherwise, unless you give up nuclear weapons. So, I don't know. So, any other question? Okay, gentleman back there. Tom, Kim.
Tom Kim from Korea University. None of you actually mentioned any possible incentive for the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons. And you talk so much about why they may have it, why they want to, in terms of their capabilities, what they have, what they want to do, and what that means to not only to South Korea and the rest of the international community. My question is, as all you know, I mean, the United States and South Korea, except possibly China, have a strong preconditions for North Korea to come back to the table. That is, they have to show clear commitment, or nowadays they keep changing their terms. Nowadays they say pre-steps, not again specifying exactly what those pre-steps are to be. One would imagine, they would probably see key components of February 29 agreement, that is moratorium of inviting IAEA inspectors back to North Korea and so forth, or stopping all the ongoing nuclear activities in Yongbyon. But nevertheless, these are not really incentives for the North Koreans to come back to North Korea, because the North Koreans insist that we will come to the table as the Chinese advises the North Koreans. They say, but unconditionally, without any conditions. Now, what are the possibilities you see or prospect of the real possible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula as it was agreed in the September 19 joint agreement? Aside from that, once you know the threat continues, we discussed so much about the missile defense and what are the primary or collateral targets of missile defensive program will be as far as the United States is concerned, but nevertheless, some of them were discussed here in these questions as well. But what would Japan, for example, do? I think Japanese gentleman mentioned that the repercussions or impact of the rest of the Pacific areas, including Japan, would Japan really go nuclear? If North Korean nuclear issue is not resolved at all, at what point, in other words, what would be the tipping point for Japan to shift from its current known position that not going to, although there is a lot of talk about going back to militarism and all that, but nevertheless, it is a possibility. And you said so much about the purpose of a non-proliferation.
So we have about 10 minutes. Would you just drop me a question?
Well, I think I said enough. All
Okay,
right.
thank you, Tong. Actually, I have just one quick question. What would be the Chinese response if South Korea joins missile defense? Okay. Now I'd like to have Manning first. Dr. Manning, you can.
Okay, there are several questions. On missile defense, I'm sorry. On missile defense, as we heard in the last panel, there's great uncertainty about what North Korea's capabilities are. If you're a prudent planner, you want to plan against a worst-case scenario. And given the fact that they've been spending most of the last 40 years trying to develop more capable missiles and nuclear weapons, have made a tremendous investment in this at the expense of selectively starving millions of North Koreans in the course of it. I'd say they're trying pretty hard, and I think we should assume that even a broken clock is right twice a day, and they may get there, and therefore the administration has made it very clear that they're looking at building a very limited regional defense architecture. Russia, as you mentioned, has raised the same concerns as China. But the one difference is we were still engaged in a dialogue with Russia about potential cooperation on missile defenses, and I think the jury is still out. It's not looking great, but I think the jury is still out as to whether that. I think there's some interesting technical issues that may make that more feasible in the near future, but. I think the problem, as I said, is that the Chinese have not been willing to discuss building a framework for strategic stability with the United States, and that makes it very hard to plan. I don't think the intention of the administration is to negate either a Russian or a Chinese second strike capability. And don't forget, we're not adversaries with either Russia or China. In fact, I can't come up with a scenario where the U.S. and Russia would be involved in a Cold War-style nuclear exchange. I suppose if you paid somebody enough, they'd come up with a scenario. But in the real world, I can't think of any. And even in China, I mean, they've been putting a lot of effort in developing anti-access capabilities. But if you step back, when you get to the political level, what Chinese general is going to go to Xi Jinping and say, well, we can take out this aircraft carrier, and I can assure you it won't escalate, and guaranteed not to go nuclear. And you flip it around the other way, what joint chief is going to go to the President of the United States and say, we have this air-sea battle concept, and we're going to preemptively take out Chinese assets, but I can assure you it won't escalate and it won't go nuclear. I don't see that as a very realistic scenario.
I think the nuclear shadow may affect the insecurity feeling of South Korean people. I'm sure that, but actually, South Korean people have high credibility, give high credibility on U.S. security assurance. Actually, South Korea and the U.S. have three layers of actual defense structure. I think combined command defense system, and also combined command structure, also very close cooperation, military cooperation system, and stationing of U.S. forces. Those all the mechanisms actually some provide some kind of security to South Korean people, even though North Korea take some very proactive nuclear provocation. In this kind of ROC and U.S. defense structure actually provides some kind of affirmative influence. But if North Korea take a very serious nuclear provocation, I think that kind of feelings can be changed. Second one is that how to prevent nuclear missile provocation. Actually, I think we need to establish nuclear deterrence mechanism on the peninsula. That's the first one. But politically, we think that we need to continue to discuss and negotiate to change North Korean behavior, North Korean thinking, and to give up its nuclear missile and give up military provocations and to come to the table for negotiation. And
about the missile defense and also the trilateral security cooperation.
Missile defense system, actually, Minister of National Defense actually clearly said that we develop Korean missile defense. But we at the summit in last April, May, the President Park and President Obama actually agreed that South Korea and the U.S. enhance intelligence cooperation between the two countries, especially the U.S. forces in Korea have a TMO cell and South Korea also AMD cell. So that kind of the AMD cell and TMO cell will enhance that kind of international cooperation. The second question you may raise that what is the difference proactive deterrence and tailored deterrence. I think that proactive deterrence is a part of tailored deterrence strategy. Okay. I believe that.
Clear.
Introduction of tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula is a very hard issue. The tactical nuclear weapons, the part of the best option to demonstrate deterrence capability in North Korea. But now we are discussing on North Korean denuclearization, so can affect negatively to North Korea. Also, as I mentioned, maybe last May, April, the U.S. sent B-52 on the peninsula, and North Korea take provocative actions. So that if crisis occurs, I think that the U.S. can deploy very quickly strategic assets on the peninsula or near the peninsula. That is one of the options. We have various options to consider, not only to rely on the interaction of tactical nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Professor Su?
Regarding the denuclearization, I would say that it's not only just a goal for all of us, but also it's the process. And regarding the threat or deterrence from the nuclear strategy of the North Korea, so we should also have the two-way as a countermeasure against this kind of threat. So we say that we need the hedging strategy. So Professor Park is also the one way, with the passive way to prepare the possible danger from the other side. But also we should have the positive way. So I would say that negotiation, the Chinese way already have that kind of way in the past. See about the talks, this also is the feasible platform for us within this kind of hedge strategy to manage the nuclear issues in the Korean Peninsula. In the past, we already done quite a lot, as Professor Charles mentioned that. But I think the situation is compared to in the previous time, that is a vicious circle in North Korea. But now, the situation already changed. I would say that North Korea already aware that in the international community, there almost no any room for North Korea to manipulate the games with others, including China. So because all of our members have a very clear stance and also take the measure within the resolutions of the United Nations. So including China, we make the very clear points that, including China, we do not accept North Korea as a nuclear state. So this push North Korea to the corner. So that's the reason why I think that's on the table of the Sigma talks. That would be still possible to make the process of denuclearization step by steps. Regarding the MD, I would say that this is very, very complicated. I would say this is the two levels, strategic level and the technical level. To China, we think it account of the strategic level very much, because this is regarding with the strategic stability over the Pacific. So that means this is the game between the big power, between China and the United States, and in the whole of the platform of the Pacific. So regardless of the kind of their concern, China, we do hope United States also has the transparency, not only China side, but also United States, so needs the transparent, makes the transparent behavior to us in negotiation or in talks, such as what the purpose of the deployments of the MD's equipment in East Asia or in some place else. So transparency is also important for both of us. Okay, thank you very much.
Sugio, would you like to respond?
Thank you. I think I have 2 or 3 questions. At first, I start to answer for the easy question rather than nuclear one. The first thing, whether we can, are there any way to prevent nuclear missile provocation or not? I think if they, just as the previous session, if they determine to launch a launch a missile or nuclear test next month, I don't think we can have any way to stop. But the important thing is to change the pattern of behavior. Repeated, sanctions or repeated consistent international efforts to for sanction after the missile or other provocations. Continuation of this kind of consistent efforts, which I hope it can change the pattern to the repeated pattern of the Brinkmanship. So I think I'm not pessimistic to transform their patterns in the long term. But if they have specific decisions the next month, I don't think we can stop that. And this could be one of the part of the answer about why didn't I discuss the incentives? And the simple answer is our topic is nuclear deterrence and nuclear strategic deterrence. It doesn't include the incentive. But the other answer is in my sense we need to keep the consistency of the policy, especially after the provocation. We should not give them any reward. So because they continue the repeated provocation pattern, so there could be no reward for them. So the ball is in their table, their court, not in our side. And the second, the difficult question about the nuclear option, I don't want to be fired. And but of course, the short answer is I don't think that is a possible or viable option for Japan. And the long answer is, just as Professor Park said, we have very credible U.S. nuclear deterrent, and both in the technical and political way. Even though Japan has some handful of nuclear warhead, it cannot be more reliable than U.S. one. So it could be a waste of money. So in that sense, I think even in the future, as long as U.S. alliance, U.S. credibility of extended deterrence maintains the current level or even higher level of the credibility, I don't think Japan needs to worry about, think about the nuclear option. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to give 1 minute to Bob.
Yeah, just to address the question about North Korean missile or nuclear provocations, it seems to me that the nuclear capability, or trying to get that, has become very much part of the regime's identity. It's even in their new constitution. And so it's very difficult for me to see them seriously moving to give them up. And, in terms of, we've heard some views from China lately of encouraging six-party talks, but we have the 229 agreement that was discussed earlier and the September 19, 2005 agreement. I don't see what there is to discuss until they commit themselves to implementing what they've already agreed to. And I think I think the ball's in their court to demonstrate seriousness. And one way they could do that is to commit to a missile and nuclear test moratorium for the duration of discussions in the six-party framework. I think that would create some confidence that it might be worth talking to them about it again.
Thank you, Bob. Because actually, there are great uncertainty existing nowadays about North Korea's nuclear strategy. It seems to me that North Korea's nuclear strategy is in the making. But as time goes by, if North Korea acquires more nuclear capability, I think the strategy would become more operational one. So I think we should put all options on the table, but while we are working toward the denuclearization of North Korea. Please join me thanking the speakers for the excellent presentation and discussion.